You can take the car, but you can't take my honor!
Keep that honor, wheelchair.
Cop mocked a disabled vet and towed his van. 5 minutes later, Marines blocked every exit. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Phoenix VA Medical Center as 68-year-old Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison slowly maneuvered his wheelchair-accessible van into the designated handicapped parking space. The modified vehicle, with its lowered floor and wheelchair lift, represented more than just transportation. It was Frank's lifeline to independence after losing both legs to an IED explosion in Fallujah 21 years ago. Frank's weathered hands, marked by decades of service and sacrifice, carefully positioned his Purple Heart license plate to be clearly visible as he activated the van's wheelchair lift. The mechanical whir of the equipment was a sound he had grown accustomed to, though it still served as a daily reminder of the price he had paid for his country's freedom. At 68, Frank carried himself with the dignity of 3 generations of Marines. His father had served in Korea, his grandfather in World War II, and Frank himself had dedicated 20 years to the Corps before that fateful day in Iraq, when his world changed forever. The explosion that claimed his legs had also taken the lives of 2 young Marines under his command, a burden of survivor's guilt that weighed heavier than any physical disability. Officer Bradley Kane of the Phoenix Police Department sat in his patrol car across the parking lot, his eyes fixed on Frank with the predatory focus of someone looking for trouble. At 34, Kane had spent 8 years with the department, building a reputation for aggressive enforcement and a particular disdain for what he called entitled disability claims. His own fraudulent workers' compensation claim for a supposed back injury, a secret he guarded carefully, made him suspicious of anyone claiming disability benefits. Kane watched as Frank transferred from his wheelchair to the driver's seat with practiced efficiency, noting the Purple Heart plate and the clearly displayed handicapped placard hanging from the rearview mirror. But instead of respect for a disabled veteran, Kane felt only irritation at what he perceived as special treatment for someone he had already judged as undeserving. Another faker, looking for sympathy. Kane muttered to himself, his hand moving to his radio as he prepared to make what he considered a routine enforcement action. Frank had no idea that his simple trip to the VA for his monthly checkup was about to become a confrontation that would test not only his own resolve, but also the unbreakable bonds of the Marine Corps brotherhood that had sustained him through 2 decades of service and 21 years of civilian life. Frank's routine at the VA Medical Center had become as precise as any military operation over the past 2 decades. Every 3rd Tuesday of the month, he would arrive at exactly 9:30 a.m. for his 10:00 a.m. appointment with Dr. Patricia Chen, his prosthetist, who had been helping him maintain his artificial legs since his return from Iraq. The parking space Frank chose was the same one he had used for years, close enough to the entrance to minimize the distance he had to travel, but positioned where his van's wheelchair lift wouldn't block traffic. The Purple Heart license plate on his vehicle told a story of sacrifice that most people respected without question, but Officer Kane was not most people. As Frank gathered his medical files and prepared for his appointment, Kane emerged from his patrol car with the deliberate swagger of someone who believed his badge gave him authority over everyone he encountered. His 8 years with the Phoenix Police Department had been marked by numerous complaints about excessive force and unprofessional conduct, but his connections within the department had protected him from serious consequences. "Excuse me," Kane called out as he approached Frank's van, his tone already carrying an edge of confrontation. "I need to see your handicapped permit." Frank looked up from organizing his paperwork, surprised by the aggressive tone. "It's hanging right there on my rearview mirror, officer, and I have Purple Heart plates." Kane barely glanced at the clearly displayed placard before shaking his head dismissively. "That doesn't look current to me, and those plates could be stolen. I'm going to need to see some identification and proof of disability." The request was both unnecessary and insulting. Frank's disability was obvious. His prosthetic legs were visible. His wheelchair was in plain sight, and his van was clearly modified for disabled access. But Frank had learned over the years that confronting authority figures rarely ended well for veterans, especially disabled ones. "Officer, I've been parking here for 20 years, Frank said calmly, reaching for his wallet. "I have all the proper documentation." 20 years of taking up spaces that working people could use? Kane replied, his voice growing louder as other veterans in the parking lot began to take notice. "I'm tired of you people thinking you're entitled to special treatment just because you claim to be disabled." The word claim hit Frank like a physical blow. After losing both legs in service to his country, after watching 2 young Marines die in the same explosion that had shattered his own body, being accused of faking his disability was almost unbearable. Several other veterans who were arriving for their own appointments had stopped to watch the confrontation, some pulling out their phones to record what was clearly an inappropriate interaction between a police officer and a disabled veteran. "Sir, I'm not claiming anything," Frank said, his voice remaining steady despite the anger building inside him. "I lost my leg serving in Iraq. I have all the proper permits and documentation." Kane examined Frank's identification with theatrical skepticism, taking far longer than necessary to review documents that were clearly in order. "This doesn't prove anything," he said finally. "Anyone can get fake papers these days. I'm calling for a tow truck." The announcement sent a shock through the gathered veterans. Towing a disabled veteran's specially modified vehicle from a legitimate handicapped parking space was not just wrong, it was cruel beyond comprehension. Frank felt his world beginning to collapse around him. Without his van, he would be stranded at the VA, unable to get home, unable to maintain the independence he had fought so hard to preserve after his injury. As Officer Kane made the call for a tow truck, Frank sat in stunned disbelief at what was unfolding. The other veterans in the parking lot had formed a loose circle around the confrontation, their phones recording every word and action. Among them was Master Sergeant David Cruz, a former Marine who now ran a security company staffed entirely by veterans. "This is wrong," Cruz said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That man has proper documentation and obvious disabilities. This is harassment." Kane whirled around to face Cruz, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. "Back off, or you'll be next. I don't need civilians telling me how to do my job." "Civilian," Cruz replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded Marines in combat. "I'm a United States Marine, and that man you're harassing is a Purple Heart recipient." The tension in the parking lot was escalating rapidly, but Frank remained focused on trying to resolve the situation peacefully. He had learned through bitter experience that confrontations with law enforcement rarely ended well for veterans, especially disabled ones. "Officer Kane," Frank said, reading the name tag on the policeman's uniform, "I understand you're just doing your job, but I really do have all the proper documentation. Could we please resolve this without involving a tow truck?" Kane's response was to turn his back on Frank and speak more loudly into his radio. "Yeah, I need a tow truck at the VA Medical Center. Got a vehicle illegally parked in a handicapped space. Driver's claiming disability, but I'm not buying it." The casual cruelty of the statement, referring to Frank's obvious injuries as claiming disability, sent a ripple of anger through the assembled veterans. Several more had arrived, drawn by the commotion, and word was spreading quickly through the VA facility that one of their own was being harassed. Frank made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Colonel James Patterson, his former unit commander, who had retired to nearby Scottsdale. "Colonel Patterson," Frank said when the call connected, "this is Frank Morrison. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm in trouble at the VA and I need help." Patterson, who had commanded Frank's unit during some of the heaviest fighting in Iraq, immediately recognized the controlled distress in his former sergeant's voice. "What's happening, Frank?" "A police officer is having my van towed from a handicapped space. He's saying I'm faking my disability. I don't know what to do." The line was quiet for a moment before Patterson's voice returned cold and determined. "Give me your exact location. Don't move, don't engage with the officer, and don't let them tow that van if you can help it. Help is coming." Patterson immediately began making calls, starting with a group text to every Marine in his extensive network. "Brother down at Phoenix VA Medical Center, all available hands respond immediately. This is not a drill." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, Marines from across the Phoenix metropolitan area began converging on the VA Medical Center. Some were active duty from nearby Luke Air Force Base, others were reservists, and many were veterans like Frank who had served their time and returned to civilian life. Captain Sarah Williams, a Marine Corps lawyer specializing in veterans' rights, was among the first to arrive. She immediately began documenting everything, taking photos of Frank's properly displayed permits, recording Kane's statements, and gathering witness testimony from the other veterans present. "Sergeant Morrison," she said, approaching Frank with the respect due to a fellow Marine, "I'm Captain Williams, JAG Corps. Colonel Patterson sent me. We're going to make sure this situation is resolved properly." Meanwhile, the tow truck had arrived and Kane was directing the driver to hook up Frank's van despite the protests of the growing crowd of veterans. The sight of a disabled Marine specially modified vehicle being prepared for towing created a scene that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. "This is really happening," Frank said quietly to Captain Williams, his voice carrying the disbelief of someone watching his independence being stripped away by the very system he had served to protect. "Not if I can help it," Williams replied, stepping forward to confront the tow truck driver. "Sir, you're about to tow a legally parked vehicle belonging to a disabled veteran. I strongly advise you to reconsider." The tow truck driver, a civilian contractor who had no desire to be caught in the middle of a confrontation between police and military personnel, hesitated. "Look, lady, I just do what the cops tell me to do. And I'm telling you that what you're being asked to do is illegal," Williams responded, her legal training evident in her precise language. "This vehicle is properly permitted and legally parked. Towing it would constitute theft. The situation reached a critical point when Officer Kane, frustrated by the growing crowd of veterans and their obvious support for Frank, decided to escalate his authority. "All of you need to disperse immediately, or you'll be arrested for interfering with a police investigation." "Investigation of what?" demanded Master Sergeant Cruz, his security company team now arriving to provide additional support. "A legally parked vehicle with proper permits." Kane's response revealed the depth of his prejudice and unprofessional conduct. "Investigation of disability fraud. I've seen plenty of you people faking injuries to get benefits you don't deserve." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. To suggest that Frank, whose prosthetic legs were clearly visible, whose Purple Heart license plate testified to his sacrifice, was faking his disability was not just wrong, it was a fundamental attack on the honor of every veteran present. It was at this moment that Frank experienced something he hadn't felt since that terrible day in Fallujah when the IED had exploded. As the tow truck driver began to lift his van, Frank felt completely helpless, watching his independence being stripped away by someone who had never served, never sacrificed, never understood what it meant to give everything for your country. "Please," Frank said, his voice breaking slightly as he addressed Kane directly. "That van is my life. Without it, I can't get home. I can't take care of myself. I'm not faking anything. I lost my legs serving this country." Kane's response would be captured on multiple phones and would later become evidence in federal court proceedings. Save the sob story, Wheelchair Boy? I've heard it all before. The cruel nickname Wheelchair Boy, applied to a 68-year-old decorated Marine veteran, created an explosion of anger among the assembled Marines that was barely contained. Several stepped forward, their faces showing the kind of controlled fury that had once struck fear into enemy combatants. But it was Frank himself who provided the most powerful response. Despite his pain, despite his humiliation, he looked directly at Kane and spoke with the quiet dignity that had defined his entire life. "Officer Kane, I don't know what happened in your life to make you so angry, but I forgive you. I served this country for 20 years, and I lost my legs so that people like you could have the freedom to treat people like me with disrespect. That's what freedom means, the right to be wrong, even when it hurts." The grace of Frank's response in the face of such cruelty created a moment of profound silence in the parking lot. Here was a man who had given everything for his country being humiliated by someone sworn to protect and serve, and his response was forgiveness rather than anger. It was then that the sound of multiple vehicles arriving simultaneously filled the air. Colonel Patterson had arrived with a convoy of Marines that included active duty personnel, reservists, and veterans from across the Phoenix area. The response to his call for help had been overwhelming. Over 50 Marines had dropped everything to come to Frank's aid. Patterson emerged from his vehicle in full dress uniform, his ribbons and decorations immediately identifying him as a senior officer with extensive combat experience. His presence transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "Officer Kane," Patterson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, "I'm Colonel James Patterson, United States Marine Corps. I understand you're having Staff Sergeant Morrison's vehicle towed. Could you explain the legal basis for this action?" Kane, suddenly faced with a full colonel, and dozens of Marines felt his confidence beginning to waver. The vehicle was illegally parked in a handicapped space. With proper permits clearly displayed, Patterson replied, gesturing toward Frank's van where the handicapped placard and Purple Heart plates were obviously visible. Staff Sergeant Morrison is a decorated combat veteran who lost both legs serving his country. On what basis are you questioning his right to use handicapped parking? The crisis had reached its peak. On one side stood Officer Kane, increasingly isolated and defensive, his actions being recorded by dozens of phones and witnessed by a growing crowd of veterans and civilians. On the other side stood the full weight of the Marine Corps Brotherhood, united in defense of one of their own who had been wronged by the very system he had served to protect. The next few minutes would determine not just Frank's immediate fate, but would expose a pattern of misconduct that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. The arrival of Colonel Patterson and the growing number of Marines had transformed the VA Medical Center parking lot into something resembling a military formation. The Marines, whether in uniform or civilian clothes, had instinctively organized themselves with the discipline that marked their service, creating a protective perimeter around Frank, while maintaining respectful distance from the ongoing confrontation. Patterson's next move was calculated and devastating. He pulled out his phone and made a call that would change everything. "Chief Torres, this is Colonel Patterson. I need to speak with you immediately about one of your officers." "Yes, sir. Officer Bradley Kane. I'm at the VA Medical Center where he's illegally towing a disabled Marine veteran's vehicle." "Sir, I think you need to get down here personally." Police Chief Michael Torres himself, a former Army officer who had served in Afghanistan, understood immediately that this was not a routine complaint. Patterson's reputation in the veteran community was impeccable, and his tone suggested that something serious was happening. While they waited for the chief's arrival, Captain Williams had been conducting her own investigation into Officer Kane's background. What she discovered was damning. "Colonel," Williams said, quietly approaching Patterson with a tablet full of information, "I've been researching Officer Kane's record. He's currently collecting disability benefits for a supposed back injury that occurred off-duty. But there are photos on his social media showing him participating in CrossFit competitions and powerlifting events." Patterson's expression darkened as he reviewed the evidence. "So he's committing disability fraud while accusing a legitimately disabled veteran of faking his injuries. It gets worse," Williams continued. "He has 3 DUI arrests that were mysteriously reduced to lesser charges, and there are 17 formal complaints against him for excessive force and unprofessional conduct." The irony was staggering. Kane, who was fraudulently claiming disability benefits while engaging in activities that proved his fitness, was accusing Frank, a man who had lost both legs in combat, of faking his disability. When Chief Torres arrived 15 minutes later, he was accompanied by internal affairs investigators and a growing media presence that had been alerted by the social media posts of the assembled veterans. The story of a disabled Marine veteran being harassed by a police officer was exactly the kind of narrative that captured public attention. "Colonel Patterson," Chief Torres said, approaching with the respect due to a senior military officer, "what's the situation here?" Patterson's response was measured but devastating. "Chief Torres, your officer, has illegally ordered the towing of a properly parked vehicle belonging to Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison, a Purple Heart recipient who lost both legs serving in Iraq. Officer Kane has accused Sergeant Morrison of faking his disability and has used derogatory language, including calling him wheelchair boy. Chief Torres looked at Frank, taking in the obvious evidence of his disabilities and the properly displayed permits, then turned to Kane with barely controlled anger. Officer Kane explained to me the legal basis for this tow order. Kane, now sweating profusely and clearly understanding that his career was in jeopardy, stammered through an explanation that made no sense. The permits looked suspicious, and I had reason to believe the disability claims were fraudulent. Based on what evidence, Torres demanded, just experience with these types of cases. Patterson chose this moment to deliver the information that would end Kane's career. Chief Torres, I think you should know that Staff Sergeant Morrison is not just any veteran. He's a recipient of the Purple Heart Bronze Star with Valor Device and Navy Commendation Medal. He lost both legs when an IED exploded under his vehicle while he was leading a convoy to deliver medical supplies to a forward operating base. Patterson paused to let that information sink in before continuing. He also spent 6 months in Walter Reed Army Medical Center and has been receiving legitimate disability benefits for 21 years. His service record is impeccable, and his sacrifice for this country is beyond question. The climax came when Patterson revealed the information that Captain Williams had discovered. I also think you should know that Officer Kane is currently collecting disability benefits for a back injury while posting videos of himself deadlifting 400 pounds at local gyms. The revelation hit Chief Torres like a physical blow. Not only had his officer illegally harassed a disabled veteran, but he had done so while committing the very fraud he was accusing Frank of perpetrating. Officer Kane, Torres said, his voice cold with authority, you are suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Remove your badge and weapon. The tow truck driver, who had been watching this confrontation with growing unease, made his own decision. Look, I'm not towing this van. This whole thing is messed up, and I'm not being part of it. As Kane was escorted away by internal affairs investigators, Chief Torres approached Frank with genuine remorse. Sergeant Morrison, on behalf of the Phoenix Police Department, I want to apologize for this inexcusable treatment. Your service to this country deserves our respect, not harassment. Frank, displaying the grace that had defined his response throughout the ordeal, simply nodded. Thank you, Chief. I appreciate that. The climax concluded with an unprecedented scene. Chief Torres, a police chief and former Army officer, removing his hat and saluting Frank Morrison in front of dozens of Marines and growing media coverage. The image would later become iconic, representing the respect that veterans deserved but too often didn't receive. The Marines who had responded to Colonel Patterson's call began to disperse, but not before each one approached Frank to shake his hand or offer words of support. The brotherhood that had sustained them through military service had once again proven its strength in civilian life. 6 months after the confrontation at the Phoenix VA Medical Center, the ripple effects of Frank Morrison's story continued to transform how disabled veterans were treated throughout Arizona and beyond. Officer Bradley Kane had been terminated from the Phoenix Police Department, lost his law enforcement certification, and faced federal charges for civil rights violations and fraudulent disability claims. Justice was served. Frank would tell reporters who continued to follow his story, but the real victory is that other veterans won't have to go through what I experienced. Chief Torres had implemented mandatory training for all Phoenix police officers on interacting with disabled veterans, with Frank serving as the primary consultant for the program. The training, known as the Morrison Protocol, had been adopted by police departments across the country. The towing company involved had not only returned Frank's van at no charge, but had donated $50,000 to the local Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter and established a policy requiring supervisory approval before towing any vehicle with veteran license plates or disability permits. Frank's story had inspired federal legislation known as the Morrison Act, which provided additional protections for disabled veterans and established penalties for harassment based on service-connected disabilities. The bill had bipartisan support and was expected to become law within the year. Most importantly, the Marine Brotherhood that had rallied to Frank's defense had formed a permanent support network for veterans facing similar challenges. Colonel Patterson had established a 24-hour hotline that veterans could call when facing discrimination or harassment, guaranteeing that no veteran would ever again face such treatment alone. Frank's van had been returned to him in better condition than before, with the towing company paying for professional detailing and mechanical inspection as part of their apology. But more than the physical restoration of his vehicle, Frank had regained something even more valuable: his faith in the system he had served and the knowledge that his service was truly appreciated. A memorial plaque honoring all disabled veterans had been installed at the VA Medical Center, with Frank's name prominently displayed as a reminder of the courage required not just in combat, but in the daily struggle to maintain dignity in the face of ignorance and prejudice. Semper Fi means forever faithful. Frank would conclude his speeches to veteran groups, and that faithfulness extends far beyond our time in uniform. We take care of our own always. This story demonstrates how the bonds forged in military service create a brotherhood that transcends time and circumstance, ensuring that no veteran stands alone when facing injustice or discrimination.